heard there's this guy that's got 650 horsepower on a stock 302 block. Yeah, he can even make it through one whole dyno run before he splits the block in half. Yeah. Alright, let's be honest. If you want to make more than 600 horsepower reliably, a stock 302 block just isn't going to cut it. In come the 351. A better block, stronger block, can easily handle 600 horsepower reliably without having to worry about splitting your block. So let's go through a few things that you're going to need to know about what you need to do this in your Foxbody. So there's going to be some questions you want to ask before you go in and start doing a 351 swap. It's very important. You can't just decide, okay, I want to throw 351 in. Got to get heads, got to get an intake, exhaust. You need to know which direction you want to go first. So let's just start with a very basic one. I think a hood is a very good example. So why is that a big deal? Well, do you want the stock hood? Or do you want a cowl hood? If you want to keep the stock hood, you're going to do a lot more modification to your car. A cowl hood, best way to go. It's an easier way to go. I wish I would have taken that route. Just not what was in the budget for me at that time. So if you want to do a stock hood, there's a lot of other things you got to do. I've got a couple of other videos out there you can watch if you want to go that route. Cowl hood, that's going to be easier. So a stock hood, that's going to be more expensive. Your cowl hood, easier. Highly recommend going that way. Another big question that you're going to want to ask yourself is going to be what type of fuel injection you want, or whether or not you want fuel injection. So either carbureted or fuel injection. EFI or carb. So this is going to depend a lot on basically your preference. Do you want to tune your car yourself? If so, do you know how to do fuel injection? Otherwise, do you know how to adjust a carburetor? If you don't know how to do EFI, or you don't want to do EFI, you're just not comfortable with EFI, carb's a good route to go. I've done both. I've had a carb and I've done EFI, taught myself how to do both of them. So it's kind of more about preference on this one. If you have a stock 5.0 in your car and you've already got the wiring harness, it's very easy to do an EFI setup on it. It's the same firing order, so you can use all of the same wiring harness that's already in your car, the same ECU, as long as it's a mass air ECU, and depending on your mods, get somebody to tune it and it'll work really good. Carbureted, obviously, that's going to be a lot easier. So the one thing about carbureted though is you'll have to worry about your fuel system. So, I mean, obviously your car is normally fuel injected. So if you go carbureted route, you might have to change out your fuel pump. I guess it depends on if you run a returnless style system or keep the return style system that's already in your Mustang. The only problem with going carbureted and keeping the stock fuel setup from like a 5.0 or something that's got a pump that's made for fuel injection is that this returns a lot of fuel to your tank, so you get a lot of aeration in your fuel. I mean, you think, EFI runs at about 45 PSI normally. This runs at maybe 6 to 12, I guess, just depending on what kind of setup you've got. If it's induction, you'll need a little bit more. But this route, if you keep the stock, EFI fuel system that was already in the car, you'll get a lot of aeration in your fuel. It makes it really hard to tune around. So that's something that you want to look at too. Another big deal is exhaust. Now the reason I say exhaust is because if you already had a 5.0 or a 302 in your car, it is a lot easier to keep that exhaust and get a set of 351 swap headers. But if you didn't have a 302 in your car to begin with, 302 headers will work. The difference is that your deck height on a 302 is shorter than on a 351. So if you use 302 headers on a 351, it's not going to line up with the stock Foxbody exhaust from a 5.0. Now, if you're making your own custom exhaust or it's a race application, that's not that big of a deal. So the big deal here is whether or not you want to use your stock exhaust or not. Now, I chose to use my stock exhaust because I already had a BBK X pipe and I had a Flowmaster catback, and I wanted to keep that because I didn't want to spend another $700 on exhaust. So the 351 swap headers, if you want to use this, you need 351 swap headers because that will bolt up to the stock exhaust. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter. So that's kind of a big deal there too. Now, the other thing is that you really want to know what style transmission you want. So your drive line. So what type of trans you want. Now, depending on what trans you get, you're either going to need a flex plate or a flywheel. So your auto, that's going to need a 28-ounce balance flex plate. Obviously, this is if you're using a stock 351 rotating assembly. The rotating assembly in my car is a 0 balance, so I had to get a 0 balance flywheel. This will just depend on your application. This is just generically if you're going with just a standard 351 short block, that's what you're going to need. So if you do an auto trans and a stock 351 rotating assembly, 28-ounce balance unless you make changes to it. The other thing is if a manual, you'll need a 28-ounce balance flywheel. So the 28-ounce balance flywheel, obviously a 302 is a 50-ounce balance, so you can't use that on a 351. You'll also have to be careful here depending on what you had versus what you're going with. The bolts are a little bit longer for a flywheel versus a flex plate. So this, you'll really want to pay attention to. So you got longer bolts with your flywheel versus your flex plate. So you'll want to watch that too. So those are kind of 4 big issues that you want to make sure that you decide on before you do this swap. So if you decide on your hood, stock or cowled, you're going to have to also decide what type of intake you want dependent upon which one of these options you want to go with. Your fuel system, you're going to need to decide EFI or carb, and that's also going to determine what you need for fuel system. So your EFI, if you need different fuel rails, so the 351 uses different fuel rails, or you have to modify the stock 302 fuel rail because it's got a wider intake plenum. So the stock 302 one won't work. So this, you'll need a new fuel rail. Where your carb, you're obviously going to need to adjust your fuel lines so that they work on this. That's kind of a big issue there too. The other thing is your exhaust, like I mentioned. Now, depending on what you want to go with, what kind of head you go with, that's also going to dictate what headers you get. But if you want to use your stock exhaust that was already on your car, like I said earlier, you'll have to get a set of 351 swap headers to bolt up to your factory 302 exhaust or aftermarket 302 exhaust, whatever you had on your Foxbody before. Now, obviously, the other thing I said is that if you're not going to use that or didn't have a 302 before and don't care about your exhaust, like a race application, 302 headers will bolt up to 351 depending on the head style. Like your GT40 heads, and then just your standard stock 351 heads. The exhaust ports are the same, but when you get into larger heads, the 351s can have a larger exhaust port, so you'll have to watch that. Then the other thing is driveline. So the trans, auto, just remember your balance is going to be different than a 302. So the other thing that, just kind of one of the other differences is the heads. So let's say you've got a set of 302 heads. They will bolt onto a 351. The problem is that the bolt holes for the head studs are smaller on a 302 than they are on a 351. So sometimes there's sleeves that are in there that you can push out depending on the head. The other thing you can do is drill out the bolt holes. That can also be an option depending, if you've already got a good set of 302 heads. And the other thing that's a big point is the intake. You have to get a different lower intake manifold for a 351 because it's got a wider, because of the deck height, the deck height is taller, so obviously your head's sit a little higher, so it's got a wider gap between head to head. So your lower intake mani is wider. So that's a big one right there too. So a lot of times, like let's say you've got a GT40 upper intake from a 302, that will bolt on to a GT40 lower for a 351, but there's not a whole lot of other intakes that are interchangeable. Like if you had like an Edelbrock upper for a 302, that would bolt to a 351 Edelbrock lower of the same style. If you've got square ports, match those up, so on and so forth. But a lot of times you'll have to get a new intake. And an EFI intake for 351 is not very cheap. A carb intake is a heck of a lot cheaper, but there you're left with making some carb modification or some fuel line modifications if that's the route you want to go. It really depends on your preference. The other thing is your suspension, and I say that for one reason. So in the front, the 351, brings up another good point too. So your suspension, if you run a sway bar, your sway bar in the stock location in the front of your car will hit the oil pan. So you also need an oil pan. That last one's a must. So you need a new oil pan and your sway bar. So if you do yes here, if you decide yes you want your sway bar because you drive your car on the street, you've either got to space down the mounts for your sway bar or you have to get SN95 mounts. So SN95 mounts actually lower down your sway bar so it won't hit the front of your oil pan. It's kind of a good deal. So the other thing, it's kind of an accessory. So if you get all this stuff figured out and you decide, okay, now I want power steering and I want air conditioning and alternator and all of that fun stuff, you've got to get the right brackets so that all of this will work. So the last piece of the puzzle is they make a 351 swap bracket. Now they make an air conditioning delete one too, so it'll just be for your power steering pump. However, if you do want to go with your air conditioning, power steering, you can get that one bracket for, it'd be the driver's side of your engine, and that'll bolt up everything to that side of it. The other piece of the puzzle is the alternator, and that all depends on what you're doing on the passenger side. Forced induction, you can get just a standard alternator bracket, like Marsh Performance, or just a cheap one from eBay or what have you, and those will work too. So these are the big points on your 351 swap. If you're really adamant about doing it, you really need to take a good look at this list and make sure that you answer these questions for your application. It's really hard to say what's going to fit for everybody's application, because if I say that this particular intake manifold is what you need for a 351 swap, then somebody's going to be like, well, I didn't run a cowled hood. Well, that was part of the deal. So you need to answer these questions for yourself, figure this stuff out, and then you'll be able to say, okay, well, these are the heads I want. This is the intake I want. I know that I need a fuel rail, so I'm going to have to get that. The exhaust, all of those things. So take a good look at this list, figure out what you need, and then go from there. That is the best advice I can give you on the 351 swap.